Hello, I'm Randall Price. Welcome to our exhibition of the history of the Bible. In this extraordinary museum exhibition, you will see for yourselves the fascinating history of Holy Scripture, from Jewish antiquity to revolutionary America. And as a prologue to the history of the Bible, you will see the most ancient origins of human writing, from the cradle of civilization, the ancient Near East, and as long ago as 3,000 years before Christ. Writing began as a pictographic or picture language, written on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia or modern-day Iraq. This progressed in time to another form of writing known as cuneiform, in which stylized wedges are incised in clay. This eventually was complemented by hieroglyphics, another type of pictographic writing, and eventually alphabetic systems developed.
The scholars agree that about 4,000 years ago, the letters that we now know as Hebrew came into creation. No one knows where they came from, but they know that they were intact when they came. So they're older than 4,000 years ago. The letters that King David and Moses would have recognized were actually pictures. From the Proto-Canaanite and the Canaanite and the Phoenician throughout history, they came down to what's called Paleo-Hebrew, or Katav Ivri, the Hebrew script. 3,700 years ago, in the Sinai, there's an example of the Proto-Canaanite, the early version of Hebrew. This actually spells the Hebrew word El, or God. In Babylon, the Jews took on a new alphabet. The same letters, a different shape. They were the Babylonian, or the Aramaic letters. These have slowly changed to become what many of you may recognize as a beautiful language, modern Hebrew.
The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered around 1947 when a young Bedouin boy tending his goat herd out in the craggy cliffs along the Dead Sea went in search of a lost goat. In the process, he found the opening to a natural cave and threw stones in, hoping to scare up the goat. Instead, he heard a very mysterious sound for that part of the desert, the breaking of pottery. He went into the cave to examine what was there and found a number of clay jars. In those clay jars were scrolls. The scrolls then were taken back to the Bedouin camp and in time sold to merchants such as Kondo in Bethlehem, who sold them to a Hebrew university professor and to a Syrian Orthodox archbishop in Jerusalem. And they revealed the secret of the scrolls to the world.
The earliest biblical fragments in existence are the fragments of manuscripts we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Bible was written much earlier than this, but no fragments of Bibles exist prior to this time period of about 200 BC to 68 AD.
The Dead Sea Scrolls represent the oldest copies we have of the Hebrew text. They close the gap by 1,000 years from the earliest copies of the Hebrew Bible that are used for the translation of our Bibles today. This is extremely significant because it takes us back much closer to the time of the actual writings of these texts themselves. And it helps us understand the transmission of the Hebrew text down through time. It's also extremely important for help us understand when a canon of Scripture developed, the books that go into the Bible, when they came into being.
The library at Qumran was a superb working library of Second Temple Judaism, and the Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of every book of the Old Testament except for the book of Esther. However, there were no New Testament fragments found at Qumran.
Among the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries were two complete copies of the biblical book of Isaiah. Now, this was dated from 125 BC, but already preserved a much older Hebrew text, which went back perhaps within a generation of the writing of the original book of Isaiah. When this was compared with versions from the 10th century AD, from which our modern versions are translated, comparing the two texts, we found they were almost identical, which indicates a marvelous preservation of the Hebrew text down through time.
The expression Dead Sea Scrolls is a misnomer and implies that the material still survives in scroll format. Although there are a few substantial scrolls, most of the material is now fragmentary.
The scrolls that were put into the high limestone caves along the Dead Sea and put within jars were sealed against the environment and were pretty much intact as they were interned in those jars. But others were put within what we call a geneza, which is a storage area, in many cases just because of the hurried conditions when they were attacked by the Romans in 68 AD. They had to put these within a hiding place. They meant to come back and dig them up, but they put them within the ground. Because of that, deterioration set in, and these are only found in fragmentary form. In other cases, some of the jars were destroyed by earthquakes, and as a result, the contents exposed to the environment, and again, disintegration of the materials occurred.
Every piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls is important to biblical studies and to the study of Second Temple Judaism. Whether in Greek, Aramaic, or in Hebrew, every piece that was discovered has been photographed under infrared light, studied with carbon-14 and DNA testing, and a massive scholarly effort has been made to put 800 texts together from over 18,000 fragments. The Septuagint is the first translation of Hebrew scripture into Greek. After Alexander the Great has conquered the region, Greek becomes the common parlance, and many Jews are actually more conversant in Greek than in Hebrew.
Around 250 BC, Demetrius Phalereus, the librarian of the famous Library of Alexandria, Egypt, requested from his monarch, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, a copy of the collection of Jewish laws to be added to the library. The king sent to the high priest Eleazar in Jerusalem, who then sent 6 Jewish scribes from each of the 12 tribes, a total of 72 men to be translators. Tradition tells us these 72 translated the work in 72 days. Hence the term Septuaginta, or 70, the term used for this translation. The translation consisted of the Hebrew Old Testament being translated into the common vernacular of the day, which was Greek, and gave to us the first translation of the Hebrew Old Testament in Greek.
When the New Testament writers cite Scripture, 80% of the time they're quoting directly from a Greek Septuagint. From the 3rd century, approximately the year 275 AD, we have a papyrus of Paul's letter to the Colossians, one of the earliest examples of a Pauline epistle in existence. It is in the language of Coptic, the language of the early Christian church in Egypt, and shows the spread of Scripture by the end of the 3rd century. In the early 4th century, after the Emperor Constantine takes power, the early Roman persecutions of Christians are terminated, and Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. Using Hebrew for the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament, Jerome translates the Bible into New Latin. Jerome's Latin translation is called the Vulgate.
Jerome's Biblia Latina, or Latin Bible, known as the Vulgate, or Common Version, was useful in his day. But over the next 1,000 years, Latin became confined to the monasteries and ecclesiastical usage. Thus, the common man was no longer able to understand or read the Bible. This lays the groundwork for the revolutionary work of John Wycliffe and William Tyndale.